Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay.
You brought them in the Mirage, the
Silence of our father's absence these past few weeks has been tangible, like the silence after a mighty roar from the fast jets he once flew at twice the speed of sound.
Menangatang, Victoria.
Dad was born in Menangatang, Victoria in 1932. With a population of 509 that year, Menangatang was known for sheep, wheat, and not much else other than the Menangatang Thirds football team, whom Lou Richards used to refer to in his football commentaries. My grandparents Ernie and Doris had 4 children, with my father being the eldest.
There was myself, Gerald, who was about 13 months younger than I am, somewhere around that. Ronald is 9 years younger than I am. And in between, I think, came my sister.
Dad's eldest brother Jerry still lives in Bendigo. His younger brother Ronald still resides in Camperdown. Sadly, my father's younger sister, Norma, passed away when he was 11 years old.
I don't remember much about her. I think she was sick and she had a mental problem of some sort. Anyhow, she died about 9. We weren't allowed to go to the funeral. Can't remember what we were supposed to, but we didn't go to the funeral.
Dad's first memories were of living in Naya on the Murray.
Naya, where I first started remembering anything. The bigger area is Naya West, but Naya had the Forestry Commission, the Water Commission. They had a pumping station down at the bottom of the Murray River to force to irrigate all the vineyards and things like that around town. Anyhow, all I remember is going to school. Solely growing up there, I guess. Remember, it was only a one-room school and had every class up to grade 6 in there. No, higher than that. I think it went to grade 8.
Later, he travelled by bus to attend Swan Hill High School.
Because from there I went to Swan Hill High by bus.
Dad always claimed he was expelled.
2 of my friends used to wag school and weren't really paying any bloody attention.
Despite wagging school with his mates from time to time, he was an above-average student and even received a glowing recommendation from the school principal for his Air Force application. My father had many fond memories of his youth, including large family gatherings at Christmas.
Phenomenal Christmas dinner for the kids. It's been 15, 20 kids all in one place, played and enjoyed themselves.
He also enjoyed riding motorbikes with his brother Jerry, who went past him at great speed one day. Dad recalled with a laugh Jerry hitting a sandbar.
I remember my brother and I rode motorbikes over there. So much sand around. I remember Gerald going past me. He was a smart ass, of course. At a great speed. And the roads used to be sand. Well, they were dirt roads, but sand came all over them from them. Talking about bloody drought and weather. That's a load of crap that we've got now. Talking about bloody weather changes. Anyhow, I remember him going past me at a high speed, hitting the sand and going arse over the top, over the handlebars of the motorbike. Didn't get hurt because he landed in the sand.
Both brothers were in the Scouts, and Dad became a troop leader attending Australia's 3rd Jamboree in Victoria's Wonga Park.
Quite a big jamboree.
Scouts, 11,000 of them arrive at Wonga Park, Victoria for their Pan-Pacific Jamboree. Scouts from New Zealand, the Philippines, Malaya, Fiji, Pakistan, Nauru, South Africa, India, Hong Kong, Latvia and Lithuania. They build their own city, providing accommodation for 11,000 in one morning. 11,000 good deeds in a day.
Dad also had an interest in electronics, and from a young age enjoying tinkering with batteries, often making crystal radio sets. When he was 11, his parents gifted him a book called Royal Air Force, which he read cover to cover, igniting a lifelong ambition to fly.
But I knew I wanted to join the Air Force then.
When Dad was just 15, he wanted to apply for the Air Force through the Radio Apprentice School, but his parents said he was too young.
Too young, they said. So anyhow, they advertised and I was ready to go.
In 1949, at 16, he applied and was accepted. He figured if he joined the RAAF as an apprentice, worked hard, and did all the right things, he would be eligible to get on a pilot's course. And he did, 5 years later.
I had to do a 5-year apprenticeship total, 5 years before I could apply for a pilot's course. To fly yet, but if I get in and become an apprentice, graduate, and do all the right things, I'll get on a pilot's course.
In 1955, my father logged his first flight, which was in the Tiger Moth A17695.
You're supposed to go solo in the Tiger Moth in about 8 hours.
A year later, in 1956, he graduated from number 21 pilot's course.
It's only the military side that call me Spike anymore, and they're slowly dying off.
Spike was fortunate to have discovered his passion at a young age, which paved the way for his almost 60-year career in aviation. Over the course of his career, he flew more than 17,000 hours in more than 110 different types of aircraft. He twice appeared in the Queen's Honours List, receiving a Queen's Commendation for valuable service in the air and an Air Force Cross for his work as chief flying instructor for the Mirage. His life is a great example of perseverance, commitment, and a desire to keep learning. He saw active service, became a fighter combat instructor, test pilot, and commanding officer flying at RAAF Base Williamtown. He then served as an examiner of airmen with the Department of Civil Aviation, a check and training captain and instructor for international airlines, a chief pilot in general aviation, and finally, a flying operations inspector with CASA. Spike was a lifelong learner and would often ask, "Did you learn something today?" In addition to his flying career taking off in his mid-20s, Dad was fortunate to meet my beautiful mother Judy. Our mother tells the story of being asked to dance and spending the whole night dancing with Dad.
Yeah, at the Palais in Hunter Street, Newcastle.
He drove her home where she insisted on him coming in for a cup of tea to meet her parents, Molly and Tom.
And I think that's the only cup of tea he's ever had.
He converted Tom to a beer, well, a shandy. And Mum and Dad were married on May 10th, 1958. Mum and Dad's young Air Force life was glamorous. A fighter pilot married a model. There were overseas postings to Singapore and Malaysia, lots of balls and parties, and many lifelong family friendships made with fighter pilot families of that era. Dad's mantra, which he had printed on his logbook, was to keep flying.
I wanted to keep flying.
He navigated his whole life around continuing to fly. He shared many of his aviation stories with us, but he never repeated a story. Most recently, In reading his logbooks with him over the past few months, my brother Craig, also a pilot, found it incredible that Dad quickly built up hundreds of hours on fast jets, but less than 10 hours of instrument time that would allow him to navigate in cloud. When Craig asked Dad why, he simply said, "I was never in cloud for too long." He was so comfortable in the sky. Dad smashed the speed record between Melbourne and Newcastle, travelling the distance in 33 minutes to Sydney, and then 44 minutes to Newcastle, at an average speed of 705 miles per hour in a Sabre. A Sabre also set the previous record, but Dad beat this by diving down over Williamtown RAAF base from 40,000 feet. He picked up speed in the process, overflying the control tower at near the speed of sound to claim the record. As a fighter combat instructor, he had 2 seasons in the RAAF Sabre display team called the Marksman. He was part of the largest aircraft ferry operation since Operation World War II, Sabres relocating to Malaya when Australia had more than 1,000 personnel deployed there.
High over Malaya, pilots of Sabre jet fighters of the Royal Australian Air Force continue their training. They operate there as part of the air component of the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve. These young pilots are among nearly 1,000 Australian airmen who make up the strength of the RAAF base at Butterworth in northern Malaya. But before these Sabre fighters could be operated in Malaya, they had to be flown from their Australian base over 6,000 miles away. This then is the story of Operation Sabre Ferry. It is the story of how the RAAF successfully carried out its greatest ferry flight since the end of the war. Before the Sabres left Australia, the squadrons were inspected by FM Osborne. Within the service itself, the plans and preparations for the flight were watched with keen interest by all concerned.
He saw active service in Malaya and describes this first bombing mission ever completed by RAAF Sabres as being executed perfectly. However, the communist guerrilla insurgents had already moved on, so the mission only disrupted a bunch of monkeys in the Malayan jungle. Dad was on the very first Mirage conversion course held at 2 OCU in October 1964.
Australia shouldn't have bought the bloody Mirage, in my opinion.
The flags of France and Australia fly side by side at Avalon Airport near Melbourne for the official handing over of Australia's first 2 Mirage supersonic jet fighters. One built in France, the other in Australia. And the official guest here, the Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies, named the Mirage as the best supersonic fighter in the world. Supply Minister Fairhold hands the logbooks over to Air Minister Fairburn, and the planes officially belong to the RAAF. The Air Force has ordered 100 Mirages, 98 of which will be assembled here. They can fly at more than 1,400 miles an hour. Sleek bat-winged fighters which can climb to 35,000 feet in 5 minutes. The Mirage can hit a target 8 miles away with air-to-ground guided bombs. It's beautiful, but deadly.
The Mirage had a radar that went as far as 28 miles.
Armed with air-to-air missiles and 30mm cannons, the supersonic Mirage will give the RAAF the greatest striking power ever. A notable advance in the history of Australian defence.
Later, he would become the chief flying instructor and test pilot.
When I was at OCU, in charge of OCU, I had 52 aircraft. Vampire, Sabre, Mirage, 2 Iroquois, and a couple of Windshields. So I flew all those while I had the right to do it.
Dad spent the next 5 years training fighter combat pilots on the Mirage. Pete Ring of the RAAF Association in New South Wales commented, "Spike was an inspiration and teacher to me as a young pilot. I gained immense learning from him. He had a terrific attitude toward young fighter pilots." At the time of the Vietnam War, he was commanding officer for flying at RAAF Base Williamtown, the home of Australia's fighter squadron. He always wanted to go to war and saw that as the ultimate test of his skills. However, the French supplied the Mirage to Australia and were opposed to the war. 2 generations of elite Australian fighter pilots were not allowed to go to war in Vietnam, which was a great disappointment for my father.
Everybody was going to Vietnam and no fighter pilots were going.
At his request, Dad did make it to Vietnam, illegally.
I went to Vietnam a few times, but illegally.
On a Hercules transport from Butterworth, Malaysia, used to fly in supplies and then evacuate the dead and injured.
Works with supplies and taking injured people home, and it was terrible.
Craig and I were born whilst Mum and Dad were based at Williamtown. We recall the Mirages flying very low over our house on the airbase. The Mirage was the fastest jet in the Western world, capable of reaching speeds of Mach 2.2 or 2,700 kilometres per hour. The afterburner really shook the earth. Spike had exceptional situation awareness and was always well ahead of the airplane. He had a very safe pair of hands that he would apply smoothly to control the aircraft. He applied the same smooth operations to passenger jet aircraft, insisting the passengers should not know the airplane has touched down or even come to a stop. In fact, at the age of 90, he still applied this smooth approach to his Toyota RAV4 as he pulled up into his driveway. The first Mirage conversions were done with a single-seat aircraft. There was no dual instruction until some time later, so first solos were done without ever having been up in the aircraft before. Can you imagine going solo in an aircraft that flies this fast and drops like a brick at speeds of less than 300 knots without ever going up with an instructor beforehand? I think this took tremendous courage, but Dad would simply say, "You just need to know what the hell you are bloody well doing with the airplane." Dad was often called upon as a test pilot to check things out after maintenance. I recall him describing a Mirage engine failure as he passed 55,000 feet. The Mirage fell to earth at a rate of 12,000 feet per minute. I asked, "What did you do?" He said, "I went over all the instruments. Then I took some notes. Then I reignited the engine." Of the 116 Mirages delivered to the RAAF, 40 were lost in accidents, and he would often say he attended too many funerals. The Mirage had a delta wing and no flaps, so it landed very fast, deploying a parachute after touchdown to slow down. At one airshow Dad performed for some dignitaries at Williamtown, he explained that he would take the first runway turn-off on his return. That seemed impossible, but he deployed the parachute while still in the air, just before touchdown, and sure enough, made the exit.
For the 50th anniversary of the Royal Australian Air Force, the Duke of Edinburgh was at the Richmond base in New South Wales to present commemorative standards to the Hercules and Caribou squadrons. Today's jet pilots look back to the 1920s with admiration for the men who founded Australia's Air Force, flying gypsy moths and wapitis. It was indeed a modest beginning to today's powerful service. Richmond was the first base to be established in New South Wales, and from here come many of the transport squadrons in action in Vietnam. It was also the home of the hard-hitting Delta Wing Mirage.
Unlike this picture of him leading a flypast for the 50-year RAAF Golden Jubilee, his most crazy idea was to fly a Mirage under the Sydney Harbour Bridge. He figured he could radio after takeoff from Newcastle, fly supersonic to Sydney, go under the bridge, and get back in less than 10 minutes to make his next reporting point. He did not fly under the bridge, but on one trip he met up with my brother in the United States. There they spent the afternoon in a simulator, and Dad flew under the bridge. My father's commitment to flying excellence and having a good time was absolute. His RAAF records show him avoiding promotions and increased admin duties and having great disdain for senior officers who had left their flying roots behind. Whilst he remained amicable, his records showed that he wasn't afraid to let the most senior officers know what he thought, especially in the officers' mess after a few beers. Both my mother and father are recorded in Dad's Air Force record, held by the National Archives, as being very social. A broken leg took Dad away from flying and effectively put him behind a desk. In his resignation letter from the Air Force, he explained he had chosen a career in aviation, not defence.
Yeah, I'd still like to fly airplanes.
He was entitled to resettlement assistance for his post-RAAF career. Unlike others who had resigned and taken management or finance courses, he convinced the Air Force to put him through a 28-day intensive flying course. They agreed, and he went back to flight training just before he left to become current before joining the Department of Civil Aviation as an examiner of airmen.
And so I got out and went flying.
He joined Air Nauru in 1974, which was a small airline flying to remote locations across the Pacific. Air Nauru did not have a lot of support for their operation, but they had some very capable pilots, and I think Spike enjoyed the challenge and operational freedom. As the national airline, they would be called upon to do flypasts. The formations were probably closer than they should have been, but it seemed Dad's flying was not the biggest risk. One time, in January 1978, Dad described narrowly missing a mid-air collision over Noumea when air traffic control was talking French to a lost French naval DC-4 pilot and English to everyone else. The lost aircraft appeared out of cloud at the same altitude, flying in the opposite direction, a few hundred feet to Dad's left. There was nothing he could do but close his eyes and imagine all the dead bodies on the ground. He later received a formal apology from the French government on the incident, which he dismissed, describing the pilot as a kamikaze and placing the blame on the French. He didn't have much time for the French, who had provided poor support for and kept the Mirages out of Vietnam.
I'm not a fan of the French. They tried to kill me a couple of times.
On another flight, Spike was forced to return when two hostesses had to be handcuffed. They had got into a physical fight in the cabin not long after takeoff when they realised they were both sleeping with the same man. That man also happened to be the first officer of the flight. Whilst Dad's first love was flying, he was a family man when he wasn't flying. He would remember birthdays, attend graduations, and important family events. He didn't ever go on holidays, but kept an album of photos of people important to him throughout his life. Dad remarried twice, initially to Tomiko, a Japanese air stewardess from Air Nauru, and later to Mary, an Alaskan living in Singapore. He also eventually divorced Mary in California and returned to live in Australia, where he became very close to my brother's daughters as they grew up. The only real constants were my mother and his flying. My brother Craig and I are so grateful to our mother for never letting Dad's personal decisions stand between any of us. Thank you, Mum, for always putting our family first. Dad left Air Nauru to join Singapore Airlines and relocated to Singapore in 1977 after separating from our mother. Dad was our hero, and it was gut-wrenching for all of us to see him leave. Of course, Craig and I made frequent trips to Singapore. My brother Craig had many global travels whilst at university. courtesy of Singapore Airlines staff travel. He met his wife Diane on one of those trips. Despite his absence in our teenage years, we always felt proud of Dad arriving into Melbourne in a 747. He would flash the landing lights at us once he saw us on the observation deck to meet him. He landed at 66 destinations around the world. In a recent email to his granddaughter Rebecca, who was travelling in Europe, he said, Vienna in springtime was his favourite European city. Listening to Strauss music in the gardens in the sunshine with a beer was always good for the soul. In 1986, on one trip back to Australia from Singapore, Dad and my brother went on an intensive gliding course at Waikiri in South Australia. Dad did earn a glider endorsement, but did not complete the gliding course they were on. This was due to his unwillingness to complete an outlanding, which is landing somewhere you do not intend to land when you took off, like a paddock. Rather than quit, he decided to get a glider towing endorsement and towed Craig up several times. On one occasion, Craig heard coming from over the radio after release. Dad had gone around to fly directly behind Craig and had him in his gun sights. Later, when Craig was standing on the ground next to the tug pilot, whom Dad had temporarily replaced, he looked up and said, "He's a real flyer, your Dad," as he fell out of the sky and set the record for the most rapid descent after a release. My brother and I took several trips on the 747 flight deck with Dad. In this image, Dad was bringing Craig back from the UK before the days of the internet. They decided to call Diane from the cockpit as they reached the Australian coastline. It required linking radio ground stations from country to country around the world, and it took about 30 minutes to get through. Dad later visited Diane's family in England before she moved to live with Craig in Australia. Diane later flew out in the cockpit with Dad when she left the UK, and she recalled feeling very special as she was ushered up from the economy cabin. She recently told him he was the best father-in-law a girl could have. Dad quickly pointed out the reverse was true. Spike's commitment to flying excellence remained absolute at Singapore Airlines. He once manually flew a 747 back to Singapore from Dubai for 7.5 hours after both autopilots became unserviceable. He would also volunteer to fly on his days off. He could not understand the attitude of some of his fellow flight crew for whom it was just a job. For Spike, flying was always a privilege. We have received several messages from ex-Singapore Airlines flight crew regarding Dad. 2 of these commented on the old approach into Hong Kong over the tops of apartments. Tom Simons commented, "My memories of Spike are filled with thoughts of good cheer and lots of laughter. He shepherded me on my first flight into Hong Kong Kai-Tak as a young co-pilot, and that night I shepherded him back from the pub called Ned Kelly's Last Stand to the hotel. The blind leading the blind. What a wonderful mate he was."
I hope your blood pressure's okay, you know. Blowing the roof off the place.
Little known is that Singapore Airlines once operated a joint Concorde service with British Airways. I recall his excitement at the possibility of flying the Concorde, as he figured he was the only qualified supersonic pilot in Singapore Airlines. Unfortunately, British Airways provided the only flight crew. At the age of 60, Spike had to retire from passenger operations. However, he found another path forward with Singapore Airlines and was endorsed on the Learjet 31 to provide advanced training to Singapore Airlines pilots. Once again, he had found a bridge to keep flying. The following year, Spike was endorsed on a citation and later, at the age of 62, endorsed as a full check captain on the West Wind flying night freight with jetcraft. At the age of 64, he had a brief stint with Chirac Air. That later collapsed into receivership the same year. At 66, he renewed his flight instructor rating, and at 68, now back working with Department of Civil Aviation, now called the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, he was called in by the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor on Christmas Day. He did this to validate obstacle clearance paths on the approach to Dili Airport. This would allow for the safe arrival of much-needed aid. Later, Spike would transition to a flying operations inspector role in Melbourne, ensuring inbound international operators were abiding by all rules and regulations. Of course, to do this work, Spike felt he needed to remain current. At the age of 72, he managed to convince CASA that he should go through a 737-700 series refresher course at Boeing in Northern America. He graduated as the oldest pilot ever to complete the course, exhausting the CASA training budget for the year. Now current, he was soon off to the Pacific, checking on his old mates in Air Nauru. Spike was gone for weeks when this notice went up in the CASA office. Actually, Dad was happily flying around the Pacific. He logged over 100 hours in command, illegally flying in the captain's seat on the left-hand side.
In a 28-day period of I flew about 23 days and got over 100 hours in that time, which is probably slightly illegal.
This image shows Spike landing in the wet at Norfolk Island for Air Nauru as a CASA FOI. When asked by his colleagues how he managed to organise all of this, he simply smiled and said, "It just happened." He was reprimanded for his actions on his return to Australia, but his only response was, "Too late, sir." In October 2022, we celebrated Spike's 90th birthday at a pub, serving his favourite foods and, of course, VB. Dad was asked whether, after 90 years, he had any words of wisdom for us. I think his reply sums up much of his life. It was, "Don't get caught." The last plane our father ever flew was the Cirrus SR-22 with my brother when Dad was 90. On that flight, Dad asked Craig to disconnect the autopilot to allow him to get a feel of the aircraft, which he did. That was a moment Craig will cherish. Finally, I suggested I care for Dad up in Townsville in his final years, and Dad was very keen to do that. He just wanted to have a few beers on the waterfront and watch the world go by. Whilst it was not as long as we would have liked, Dad did it, and the last few weeks of his life was a special time. Craig and I went through a lot together the last few months, and it brought us closer together, despite Craig smashing my car in an empty car park. After Dad passed, Craig and I went past the RAAF base in Townsville with Rebecca to capture this photo on the way to having a beer for him on the Strand. Whilst at the Strand, we saw the silver silhouette of a jet aircraft fly past the full moon in the distant sky. To quote one of Dad's favourite poems, we're pretty sure it was him, in that Mirage, slipping the surly bounds of earth to dance forever on laughter-silvered wings. Godspeed, Dad.
Yeah, I'd still like to fly airplanes.
Somewhere over the rainbow that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow skies, a blue wind, the dreams that you dare to dream.